being able to come up with a little more of an answer about why did this man, who was so heavily involved in civil rights work in this country, make this transition over to Africa, work in Africa? I mean, how many people made that choice? And yet it was something that he was compelled to do. As Connie Field was interviewing him and asking him about this, he started going through the events. And then she said, but why? You know, why did you make that choice? And he said, oh, you want to go a little deeper. So then he talked about, well, first of all, I come from a very international background. I was the son of ministers and missionaries, and my early 5 years of my life, 5 years until I was age 8, was spent in the Philippines. And I lived among people who were different, looked different from me, and that was my early childhood. And then when I went to college, I spent a year in China, and I was an exchange student in China, and I had a Chinese roommate, and those two experiences, plus the fact that I was brought up with parents who were very much concerned about the international scene, and I embraced that. And so it was his international background, first of all. Then what he said was, and I come from a Christian heritage, and what I learned was that all human beings are brothers and sisters. We're all children of God. There is no difference among us all. Whatever our background is, whatever our color is, whatever our national origin is, it just doesn't matter. And he believed in egalitarianism, that all people should have equality and should have the opportunity for self-determination. And he was very much influenced by Gandhi. And of course, you know, Connie Field said, well, Gandhi, he worked in South Africa, right? And my dad said, well, yeah, that is true. And maybe that had some effect, but it was really some of these other things. And then we get into the Defiance campaign, which he talked about briefly in the movie. But he was involved in civil rights work in this country. First of all, he lived in New York. He worked on the Lower East Side. He would wander the streets of Harlem. It was just what he did. And then when he was graduated from the seminary in Chicago, because of his prison background, Union didn't want him back, so he went to the Chicago seminary, and he really encountered racism there in Chicago and was working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and CORE, which he founded with James Farmer. And they were using nonviolent tactics. He worked in the FOR with Bayard Rustin. And they, together, Bayard Rustin and my dad, organized the Journey of Reconciliation, which was the first freedom rides back in 1947, the progenitor of the freedom rides in, what was it, 1961 or 1963? Anyway, they're not early 1960s. I should know that. You could correct me, anybody, just shout it out. But so his nonviolence background, heritage, his international perspective, and then as I was thinking of words that come to mind when I think of my dad. So, number 1, peacemaker. Number 2, activist. Number 3, egalitarian organizer and fighter, non-violently, of course. And the last one is adventurer. He just loved adventure, and he also loved to be on the vanguard of something new. It was just so exciting to him. So he was in the civil rights work back when it was just at the beginning stages in this country. I mentioned the Journey of Reconciliation, which was like 13 or 14 years before the Freedom Rides. And so now, having sort of made this composite of this human being, then we can talk about the events that attracted him and pulled him into the work that he did concerning Africa. So what happened was, and I wanted to actually shout out during the film there was a one shot of him standing with an African-American man who was balding with glasses. His name was Bill Sutherland. Bill Sutherland wrote my dad a letter and informed him from his contact with an editor in London about the Defiance campaign, which was taking place. It was being organized. It hadn't started yet, but it was being organized to begin in South Africa to defy peacefully, non-violently, unjust laws like the past system. So my dad and a nucleus of other folks that he had worked with in peace and race relations in this country decided to organize a group to work in support of the Defiance campaign. And the name of that group was Americans for South African, just a second here, I want to give you the exact name. Americans for South African Resistance. That was the first organization. And what they did was to both inform as they could. They developed a mailing list from all of their other contacts. They sent out information about the Defiance campaign. They leafleted. They had a motorcade on Palm Sunday before the actual Defiance campaign began. It began in about June 26th of 1951. And which incidentally, June 26th is my parents' wedding anniversary. Interesting, a little connection there. They wanted to inform as many people as they could in this country about what was happening in South Africa, and they also wanted to raise money to send over. And they had a contact by the name of Z.K. Matthews, who took money that they raised over to South Africa. But then people were being arrested in South Africa, and it wasn't safe to send money over there, because if you sent money to somebody, that person would be arrested for receiving money for the Defiance campaign. So the Defiance campaign folded at some point, and so did Americans for South African Resistance. So then my dad was at this point, okay, he'd been doing this work without pay. He was still with the FOR and with CORE. Then he decided, okay, I've got to make up my mind what I'm going to do here. And that's when he decided to take that trip to Africa. And that's when he made the switch. He left those organizations, the FOR and CORE, and became executive director of a new organization called the American Committee on Africa. And the focus was that there were only 4 independent nations in Africa at that point. And it was right at the beginning, right at the vanguard of something that he sensed was really big and really important. His international perspective, he could see that the connection between the civil rights movement in this country and the work against apartheid and for Africa, freedom and self-determination. And he was very excited. And that's where he just dedicated his energies and his efforts for many years. So that's, I think, basically what I want to say. And I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions, or we can go on to singing right now. But I just wanted to give you that sense. Yes?
Martie, I was just wondering,